Welcome back, everybody. This is the second part of a two-part lecture on the early American Empire. We've already discussed those first few years, the first few decades immediately following the Constitutional Convention. And we looked at how some of the political maneuverings and political figures of the time really influenced American politics. We also discussed the difference between republic and democracy. Today, we're going to focus quite a bit on the market revolution. And with that, we're going to do a little bit of nestling. We're going to discuss some components of the religion and reform movements of the 19th century that influenced America at the time. But we're really going to focus mostly on the market revolution. You can see that as part of these two lectures, we're covering chapter 7, 8, and parts of 10 in American Yacht. So what do you think I mean when I talk about the market revolution? What are some of the words that come to mind that are synonyms with market or synonyms with revolution? When we talk about the market revolution, we're describing an era in American history where everything kind of changed over from at-home, localized economy, home-based work like farming and artisanship, so things like blacksmithing or horseshoeing, things like that. Those things began to transition and transform into more of a capitalist model. So people stopped working from home and began working in larger cities or in factories or as part of a production cycle that spanned the entire continent. So those are some of the things we'll be talking about mostly today. One of the most exciting things that I think emerges from the market revolution in 1825 is the Erie Canal. If you take a look at this little inlet map over here where it identifies the state of New York, you can see the size of all of New York. New York is a huge state. Even though New York City and New York Harbor are kind of down here on this little island, the entire whole of upstate New York is rather large. This is an era without a lot of transportational technology. One of the best ways to get materials and people to and from places is through water, right? So remember back 1803, just about 20 years prior, Jefferson had negotiated to purchase the entire territory of Louisiana from the French. Now the question was, how do we get people into Louisiana to populate these new territories? Well, everyone had to essentially cross the Appalachians. They had to go by foot or by wagon in order to get into those territories. But there's tons of water in the parts of the Midwest that were connected to Louisiana. Up here near upstate New York, you have the Great Lakes, those 5 lakes that span kind of the upper Midwest. But there was no way to get from New York Harbor into the Great Lakes until the Erie Canal. So this is an era of like steamboats, right? Boats are becoming bigger and faster. Canal building is happening all across what's today the United States. But also railroads are being built and telegraphs. All of these new lands that are being opened to settlement are being influenced by these innovations. And so the Erie Canal is 363 miles of a canal that is dug between New York Harbor and the Great Lakes region. For the first time in global history, ships could go across the land, essentially, between New York Harbor and into the Great Lakes. It opened up places for development like Buffalo and Syracuse and Rochester, but it also opened up potential future for places like Detroit and Chicago, which would ultimately shape the development of American history from this point forward. This allowed goods and people, like I said, to flow in and out of the Northeast and into the Midwest, and it helped to promote additional settlement into the West. So we're going to talk about the West a lot in this class. As we move forward for the remainder of the semester, we're going to talk about 2 topics all the time: the Civil War and the American West. And frankly, you cannot understand the Civil War without understanding the role of the West. So this is a map from the Lewis and Clark expedition, but it gives you a really nice color-coded version of the territories. In pink, you have the United States. In purple, you have the Louisiana Purchase, which was acquired in 1803. And in gold, you have Spanish territory. Settlers, squatters, people who were just like building and living in homes in those territories without actually purchasing the land. And explorers helped to expand America's borders during this period from about 1830 to about 1840. In fact, between 1790 and 1840, 4.5 million people crossed the Appalachian Mountains, and this was more than the entire US population when George Washington was in office. About 1 million of those people were slaves. Down here on the southern parts of the United States, as you begin to see the expansion of west, so draw your eyes or your hand, kind of follow the map to the left from the southern part of the pink section into the purple and eventually the yellow. All of that is still ripe for agriculture. There's a ton of agricultural opportunity in places like modern day Kansas or Missouri or Iowa, and even into the upper Midwest like Minnesota. So Southern farmers who are plantation owners begin looking to expand their land holdings into the West. Meanwhile, Northerners, hoping to expand their industry holdings, are looking to the West as well. So here's an interesting paradox. If you've ever seen, like if you're ever driving on Baseline Road and you see what's left of some of the few cotton fields that still exist in South Phoenix, you might recognize that at some points while they're growing, they're like green and really kind of like a foresty color. But then by the time that the cotton is ripe for picking, the plants themselves are very brown, and the cotton looks like little cotton balls, like what you buy at the store, in just like a white fluff. But that white fluff has to be removed from the plant, and there are these sticky, spiky seeds that are woven into those cotton balls, and you have to pull them apart in order to be able to use that cotton for production. This is very labor intensive. It requires people in their hands sitting for hours just picking apart cotton. This is one of the primary responsibilities that slaves had on cotton plantations. In 1793, a guy named Eli Whitney produces and patents the cotton gin. And you can see this picture here. It's this enormous machine where you can dump those cotton balls into it and then process by a hand crank and later other mechanization to separate the cotton, that soft fiber, from those sticky, spiky seeds. So you might be thinking, oh, great. So now there's a machine that exists that's actually creating ways to separate the cotton from the seeds. Maybe this will lessen the demand on human labor. But actually, it increased the demand for slave labor in the late 1790s and early 1800s. Here's why. Farmers began to see how quickly cotton could be separated and produced on their lands, so they were able to grow more cotton, right? They were able to expand their cotton plantations because this machine helped them produce it more quickly. Also, when you think about the South as this agricultural empire, the South has got these big plantations that are like major farms of rice or tobacco or sugar, or in this case, cotton. As cotton becomes the primary export of the South, these cotton balls, they're just raw. Like somebody has to do something with them to make cotton useful. Well, during the market revolution, you have an expansion of industry in the North in places like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. And so Northerners begin opening factories that produce clothing, or they're called textiles. They take raw cotton, they separate it, they weave it on a loom, and then they weave it again, and it gets processed into these long sheets of fabric like what you buy at the fabric store. Okay, well, the North begins to process the South's cotton. And in turn, the North becomes significantly wealthy because then they're selling all of this cotton, all of this cloth to people all over the Americas and people in Europe. So now the North is implicated in slavery. They did not develop separately from slavery. They developed because of slavery. So true or false, think of this to yourself. The cotton gin and the expansion of slavery west, as well as the increase of slave labor to produce cotton, made the South more reliant on slavery than the North. The answer is false. They were both reliant on slavery. So what's going on in the North? If the South is expanding its agricultural empire on account of the cotton gin and also westward migration, what's happening in the North? Well, Northerners are becoming more settled in a different way. They become bound by a web of transportation like the Erie Canal, and also credit to Eastern centers like businesses, manufacturing places, and factories. Northerners become more and more ingrained in the economy and the banking infrastructure of the North industry. So farmers who used to be like people who worked and lived at home and never really left the house to work, they worked in home, they began drawing themselves into a new market economy. Increasingly, Northerners become concentrated on, instead of subsidiary farming, like where you grow or cultivate everything you need for your own home and your own family, they begin to do what's considered corporate farming. Farmers began growing crops and raising livestock for sale. So like one farmer might grow primarily corn, another might grow primarily wheat, right? And then they sell to each other instead of each guy growing his own little plot of corn and his own little plot of wheat, right? And then the other thing that happens is they begin purchasing goods that they used to just make at home. So purchasing food, purchasing clothing items, and purchasing other products. Whereas 30 years prior, they would have been making all of that stuff at home. So that's what's happening in the North. What's also happening in the North is a rise of cities. For the first time, because of all this surplus of cotton, the rise of factories, a gathering of large group of workers that were under central supervision of one boss, and factories were also really reliant on power tools instead of hand tools. These began forming all over the Western frontier and in the Northeast. Industry really transforms the way Americans begin to think about things like time. So think about it. If you're a farmer living in like Nebraska, Louisiana Territory, what's today Nebraska, you're 100% regulated by like rhythms and seasons and when things need to be planted or reaped or harvested, right? Industry, on the other hand, is set to a clock and production deadlines. But somebody has to work in these factories. Even though there are these power tools, these power looms, for example, that are weaving all this cotton, you need someone there to make sure things are getting threaded correctly, or that the machines are running, or that like things are getting pulled out once they're produced. Every machine requires several people. So factories begin employing cheap labor, people like unmarried girls who didn't necessarily need to pay for an entire family, right? Or immigrants. Economic expansion in America fueled a new demand for labor and attracted immigrants from places like Germany, China, and Italy, who all arrived looking for jobs. In response, there were a lot of people who were very resistant to immigrants. This is like 1810s, 1820s. There were people who feared the impact of immigration on American political and social life, and they were called nativists. They actually blamed immigrants for urban crime, political corruption, and alcoholism, and they accused immigrants of stealing American jobs. This is like 200 years ago this started. So when we talk about kind of the rhetoric of patriotism or nativism or nationalism in America and how it's linked to anti-immigration sentiment, this was common as early as the 1800s. So it's really unfortunate that this has become part of the American fabric. But the reality is there are a lot of people who believe that immigrants bring with them diseases, bad behaviors like alcoholism, and they are competition for high quality jobs. There's something else that's happening at the time. On account of westward migration, but also the rise of the market, right? The economy that's based on purchasing. There's a new kind of feeling in the air of like what makes an American. And it was called rugged individualism. The market revolution and westward migration produced kind of a new assumed American identity, a belief that Americans were rugged, right? We were tough, that we were energetic and excited, and we were this young country full of ideas, but also that Americans were materialistic because they were purchasing so many things that they didn't necessarily need, that they could have created themselves. And also the argument or belief that Americans are constantly in motion, moving west, digging ditches, creating canals, sending ships into land, right? And into places where there's now water. Americans actually believed this. And they believed that this set them apart from the old world, right? European kind of ways of thinking. There's also the belief of manifest destiny at the time, that the West represented God's will for Americans to civilize and Christianize all Native people living in the West. They also thought the West allowed for the expansion of the American experience and experiment. Meanwhile, this is also the era of the Second Great Awakening. So it's like the 1830s. And you begin to see religious revivals and utopian societies becoming commonplace in America. You have religious camps, groups like in this picture that are like forming around these tent communities. They're coming together in like upstate New York or places like Ohio, and they're speaking in tongues, they're worshiping in these large groups. But you also see a rise in utopian societies, separate of the traditional or mainstream Christianity, like Mormonism, Shakers, the Oneida community, for example. The Second Great Awakening also stressed the rights of private judgment, your own judgment, and your own universal salvation through good works and faith. And many, a part of the Second Great Awakening, looked westward for potential expansion options. So this is a time of great opportunity. This is a great time of great wealth in American history. But there were limits too. The 1830s created opportunities for rapid economic advancement, so making a lot of money, and the rise particularly among the middle class. But not all Americans could take advantage. Over 200,000 Blacks who lived in free northern states, who themselves were free, faced constant discrimination. They were barred from schools, from public facilities, and from jobs. They faced hostility and nativism from white artisans. And in fact, they couldn't even move west for a better opportunity. Federal law barred all African Americans from moving west or accessing public land. And what's going on with women? Women at the time too, it's like the 1830s, they found that many of these opportunities of the market revolution were closed to them. This is the era of a time called the cult of domesticity. This is a time when what used to be the center of all economic activity was the home, all of a sudden begins to decline because the city, the outside place, that public sphere, is becoming the center of commerce, politics, and public life. Moreover, women's roles were undermined by mass-produced goods that used to be made at home. Women used to be the primary creators of most products, clothing, bedspreads, right? Most farming. They had a lot to do with creating those most important components of family life. But during the market revolution, often those goods were for sale instead. So instead of being artisans and creators and creatives, women became shoppers and not on account of their own interests. There were also new definitions of femininity that defined a woman's contribution not to the family's economic well-being, but to a private environment that shielded her family from the market. So more and more women are being drawn back from the experiences of politics and money-making. But with men away from home so often, women did exercise more authority once they were in the home. However, these truths pertained mostly to white, middle-class American women. There are several primary sources that you could read if you're interested in doing more on the market economy. You could look into much of the kind of rise of abolition as a result of the market or as a result of the Second Great Awakening. You could also look at the movement of Americans into the West. And with religion and reform, you can look on how Americans began to think about nature or femininity or the role of humanity, right? You can look at any one of these to write a story or dive deep into one person's perspective on these eras of the market revolution.